And thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. When I arrived in July, Tina said, "Oh, you could do a topic on the Rust Belt." It was kind of right after the election, and I thought, sure, no problem. And I thought there might be interest, whereas 3 or 4 years ago there may not have been. People would have maybe asked questions, especially in Finland or outside the United States, or even in parts of the United States. I mean, why do we need to talk about this topic? And so, but after the elections, I think, and even since the elections, continuing into recent weeks with questions of tariffs and some other things, I think it's a region that people are focusing on a little bit more than they may have been a few years ago. I've already met a few people who could definitely give this presentation in my place, and so I'm really happy to have someone who I met several months ago in Helsinki who's from the town next to me, which both very small towns. So she's in the room today, also from the Youngstown area in Ohio, and several others that I've met over the last several months who know these issues, I think, really well. So before I get started and kind of go into a very long presentation, I kind of wanted to get a sense for how many people have traveled in the United States and specifically in this region, the Rust Belt. Okay, so about half. And if I were to ask you some of the things that just immediately come to mind when I say Rust Belt, maybe aside from the word rust, what comes to mind when I say the Rust Belt? Anybody?
Poverty.
Okay.
Steel.
Okay. Any others? All right. So poverty and steel, those are two that maybe we'll touch on a little bit today. But I just wanted to really quickly start it off and say that it's actually quite a large geographical area. It's a very populous geographical area. It's a very influential area, especially politically and economically in the United States. I think if you're in the United States right now, but also in other countries, you'll definitely kind of get a sense for that. I also think it's a region that's quite misunderstood, particularly in the American media, which is increasingly kind of focused on the coasts, the East Coast and West Coast. And that's something I'll get into a little bit. But more than anything, I just really want to introduce the area. As I said, it's a very large area, and I have a map on the slides, and I also have a map over there, and I can kind of show what people think of when they traditionally think of the Rust Belt. And it's an area that I think we can make some generalizations about, but it's also, I'll never in a 30 or 40-minute presentation kind of really get into the heart of it. So I'm really just hoping to kind of introduce this subject today. So I'll start out with kind of what I think are some of what the region looks like on a map, maybe. Then I'll talk about some of the history and some of the stereotypes maybe that people have of the region. And then I'll get into some of the statistics about what the region actually is, politically, which states comprise the region when we talk about Rust Belt. And then I'll finally close it out with just a really narrow kind of case study on Ohio, and then Youngstown, Ohio, which is the area that I'm from. And the reason I chose those are two. So Ohio is one of the most populous states in the Rust Belt, but it's also the only state that's traditionally placed completely within the Rust Belt map. And it also, luckily, is the state that I come from, so it's easier for me to talk about. And Youngstown is traditionally thought of as one of the epicenters of the Rust Belt. So people think of Youngstown, they think of Flint, maybe Detroit, Gary, Indiana, and some other cities. And so it's also my hometown, so it's easy to talk about. So anyway, that's kind of just a really brief overview of what we'll do today. If I can get the clicker to work. All right, so that's exactly what I mentioned. All the photos in the presentation are from Flickr. Generally, there are a couple that I've actually taken, but this is one of Cleveland. In the overview, this is exactly what I just mentioned, what I'll talk about today. And if anyone has any questions at any point, please feel free to ask. You don't have to wait until the end or anything. So I'll start out at the top, and these are what I consider kind of the key takeaways of this presentation. The first is that the Rust Belt is not a geographical or demographic construct. You won't see the United States Census Bureau talk about the Rust Belt, for example. It's very much a political construction, which I'll get into later. And it's also a very problematic concept, which we'll also definitely touch on. It's been used since the early 1980s. 1984 is probably the first reference to it. so even though it's a problematic concept, it's also a concept that has a lot of salience nowadays. And so some people would love to get rid of the term. Many people want to keep the term because it's become sort of central to the identity of someone. And those questions are really, they're often generational questions, and we'll touch on that a little bit as well. Despite what you might see in the media or other sources, it's actually a very diverse geographic region, economic, ethnic region, and we'll touch on those questions as well. And the final one is, this is really an introduction, and it's my introduction to the region. But unless you experience it yourselves, you probably, don't always just take my word for it. Let me put it that way. Missy, others may have, you were just in Indiana, you may have other concepts of what the Rust Belt is or means. So this is one map. This is not a perfect map, but it was a map that was, it came without the need for permission to use it. And this is a map of what people consider the Rust Belt to be, at least some. For me, you'll see that Ohio fits completely in. A good part of Indiana, part of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, more or less up to the Buffalo and Syracuse region, the lower part of Michigan, parts of Illinois and Wisconsin. There are others who, and I'll go over to this map, there are others who talk about the city of Baltimore and Maryland as part of the Rust Belt, or St. Louis, Missouri, for example, because they have a lot of the same characteristics. I think of it, when I think of the Rust Belt, I think of really the industrial part of the United States as it's been from the late 1800s all the way up and arguably until even today. And it was often very tied economically to the Iron Range region of Minnesota. And so I kind of think of it more as a Great Lakes economy. So if you look at the Rust Belt, it's really cities that were shaped, at least in part, by the movement of materials and manufacturing goods from the upper part of Minnesota through the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, a lot of the raw materials coming from Lake Superior, that region, down for manufacture in Chicago, Gary, Milwaukee, Detroit, Youngstown, those cities. So this is just one map. If you Google the map, Google Rust Belt map, you'll see other representations of the space. So one thing I wanted to just to kind of show what the region looks like visually. So when you look at that map of the Rust Belt, it looks like this very neat kind of space, the whole state of Ohio and part of Indiana, as if those entire regions are rusty, for example, or, but when you actually look at individual states, they're much more diverse. They're incredibly diverse spaces. And so I looked at images of Rust Belt and then images of Midwest, which is what the Census Bureau would deem the Rust Belt to be part of, the Midwestern United States. And let me see if I can pull these up. I just Googled these a little while ago. And so this is the Midwest. And so you have these almost completely farm images, these very happy little children, just very bucolic kind of imagery. And this is, in theory, the same region as the Rust Belt, which is, on the other hand, a very different representation. You have, by and large, you have representations of sort of decay, industrial decline. And in theory, these are really they're the same spaces. It's the Rust Belt, it's the Midwest, it's actually part of the same region. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how problematic the term Rust Belt, frankly, is. And now you start to get into some of the narratives, and these aren't just in the United States, but internationally. Here's a version from the UK. And so a lot of this is kind of before the elections, but here's everything you need to know about this region, which refers to abandoned factories of cities where white working class men are disaffected with the political system. We're talking about a region of tens of millions of people that is absolutely not exactly defined by that one sentence. But that was kind of how coverage of the region was dominated, especially in the run-up to the election, but even since then. So that's kind of a UK version. Here's a version from the Atlantic, which is a very prominent kind of elite circle outlet in the United States, and all the men here are either on drugs or unemployed, which is quite a statement when you think about it. And it's a quote from someone, but it's also very representational of the article at large, which tends to focus on opioid addiction, or in the previous example, on economic decline. So this is an image from a Detroit factory. And we'll get into kind of the photography of ruins a little bit, and happy to take questions. But this is kind of representational, or a good representation of a genre that some people call ruin photography, some people call it ruin pornography, because it's this imagery of just decline. Usually the images do not involve people, so it doesn't show kind of the people who are living in these spaces, continuing to make a living, starting farms, doing progressive activism, whatever it might be, but these images just really tend to focus on the decline aspects. And here are some of the narratives that I think really surround the region, honestly, just based on what I see in the media. I didn't pull these from a site. These are narratives that I kind of see when I look at the region. Certainly economic devastation. In the past several years, drug addiction, I think, has emerged as a huge narrative, especially in Ohio and Indiana, West Virginia. Just yesterday, the First Lady, for example, spoke on the opioid crisis in the U.S. White men, overwhelmingly, especially around the election coverage, you see nothing but articles featuring, white unemployed factory workers, white male unemployed factory workers. The concept of white in this case is quite problematic because, as we'll see, what now are considered white male individuals or whatever 80 or 90 years ago were actually Russians and Ukrainians and Slavs and Greeks and Italians, and it was one of the most diverse regions in the world. Conservatism, I think a lot of the press tends to focus on the region as being fairly conservative, even though if you really look in depth, you'll see a huge range of conservatism and what we call in the United States liberalism. And then the final one is flyover country. There have been books written about kind of this region that's not really worth seeing. It's between New York and LA. Maybe go to Chicago, and it's really a concept. And there's actually a prominent conservative voice in the United States who used this flyover country as kind of this book, almost a rebellion against kind of what she believes is kind of elitist thought coming out of DC and New York. So it's this thing that's kind of spawned into taking on a meaning of its own, really. Does anybody have any questions kind of as I get started here? No? All right. So what feeds these narratives about the region? Here are just a few. And first of all, I don't mean to say that there isn't truth behind these things either. There are plenty of ruins in the region. There are probably higher percentages of unemployed. There are higher percentages of opioid addiction, heroin addiction, certainly in the last decade or so. What I'm talking about is more kind of the exclusive focus on those themes. A few of the trends I think that have really kind of pushed these narratives, certainly for American populations, but arguably for others, is the decline in the news industry in the United States in particular. For example, this is a citation from Belt Magazine, which is a press outlet that focuses exclusively on the Rust Belt. And there's been a 33% decline in the number of journalists in the region since the late 1990s. And then it cites, for example, Chicago, which has 4 times the population of Washington, D.C., but only a third of the journalists. That's maybe arguably a problematic comparison because D.C. obviously has a lot of foreign correspondents and stuff. But if you look at other cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, the number of journalists there is actually much lower than comparable cities in other parts of the United States that are that are operating primarily on the coasts. There's a concept of what we call fly-in or parachute journalism, and this really kind of takes off. Where I come from in Youngstown, for example, it's a swing area within the swing state of Ohio politically. And so every 4 years, hordes of politicians and journalists descend on the area to capture the mood in Youngstown and also to campaign, of course. But they're often, especially the journalists, they're coming in from DC or New York, maybe from the West Coast, and they'll come in for 4 hours, and they kind of have this standard tour where they interview the same unemployed factory worker that the other outlet did, and it's just this really, they're not really, in my view, getting a very broad range of opinion from the population, but it's almost like a tourist trail where they kind of hit these abandoned places, then they'll talk to this person at X restaurant, and we call it fly-in or parachute journalism because they come in for 4 hours and then they leave. And Anne Trubeck, who's been a voice who's kind of led this, she was the founder of Belt Magazine and is now publishing quite a few books on the region. She talks about how there's kind of a colonial tinge to this type of journalism. It's big coastal outlets who are writing about people living the other way, the othering of these people in this region. And it's kind of an interesting perspective when you look at it like that. And then the other final piece is maybe parochialism. It's a region that, you won't find a travel guide for Ohio, for example. There's not a Lonely Planet Ohio. There's a Lonely Planet everywhere else, but you won't find a Lonely Planet Ohio. You won't find a moon guide to Ohio. It's not a state that's generally viewed as a huge tourist destination. And so there's almost this, again, Anne Trubeck, she talks about how there's this kind of elitist pride at sort of not knowing what Ohio is or whatever. And the exact quote is on my screen below, but she talks about how you talk to someone in New York and they're proud that they've never gone to Ohio. Why would you go to Ohio? That's not America or whatever. And so it's kind of an interesting. It's just legions of people have not traveled to the region and really don't have a good understanding of what it is. Similarly, you could argue many people who live in Ohio and in those regions haven't traveled widely outside those regions, and so it's kind of it's a very large country, and you have two people who are. Ohioans may not know people in New York very well or the issues, and so it's kind of an interesting way that feeds these narratives. So the Rust Belt, the first known reference came from the 1984 election, which wasn't very close, as you can tell. So this is Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale, who only won Minnesota, which was his home state. But Walter Mondale, when he was campaigning in Ohio in 1984 at LTV Steel in Cleveland, talked about how Reagan's economic policies, Reagan had been president for 4 years, he talked about how Reagan's economic policies were turning the region into the Rust Bowl, which was a reference to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, if you're familiar with American history. Journalists in particular really picked that concept up, and it kind of evolved into Rust Belt, which more closely kind of matched narratives of the Sun Belt, for example, the movement of populations, particularly from the north to the southern United States or the western United States. And so you began to see a lot of talk about the Rust Belt, not the Rust Bowl, but the concept really came from Walter Mondale in a political rally. So that's one of the more important points, I believe, is that it's not a geographic construct. It's really something that's always been talked about politically, the Rust Belt. Yeah, again, it's also not the only kind of way the region's talked about. Arsenal of democracy, if you look back into the 1930s, 1940s, in the run-up to World War II, and particularly during World War II, the region was referred to as the Arsenal democracy, which is a term that came out of Detroit, a journalist in Detroit at the time. But if you look at it, I mean, for example, Pittsburgh, which is kind of one of the quintessential steel cities, it provided 1/5 of all the steel for the Allies during the war, just the one city. And if you look at Youngstown and all the way up through Cleveland, the Mahoning Valley, the Steel Valley, the region produced this huge amount of war material. The industrial Midwest is another one you hear. Post-industrial Midwest is one that is kind of used by people who want to talk about the Rust Belt but don't want to use such kind of loaded phrasing. And the Water Belt is kind of a new one. I think it's maybe kind of a booster way to talk about the region, trying to reframe what they find as, they see the Rust Belt as a really problematic thing, especially for future economic development. And so you'll start to see kind of things about the Water Belt recently, which really gets into the kind of the identity of it. So Rust Belt chic is this concept that's kind of come around in the past 10 years in particular, and it's really this concept of, it started out as a reaction by someone who was a comic book author in Cleveland, and his wife kind of talked about how people would come in from the coasts to interview him and get this sense of Rust Belt chic. She called them anorexic vampires because they'd come in for a few hours and just look at these folksy kind of charming people, and they'd interview them and then they'd take off. And she really hated that. The term, in my view, has really kind of taken on a life of its own, though. It's kind of used now as a sign of pride of being from that region and representing some of the values and some of the history of what's really a fascinating region. And the other one came from a friend of mine when I was in high school, this blow it up and plant a tree. But he talked about Youngstown in the 1990s, which was arguably the worst time to be in Youngstown. And I didn't grow up in the city, but I grew up close enough to kind of understand some of the things going on. And he's, what was his quote from school? It was, blow up Youngstown and plant a tree, because it was just so hopeless. Let's just move beyond it. So I see that as kind of, that's not a phrase you'll ever hear again, probably, which is fine. But there are people who really want to take pride in the region and preserve some of the history and some of the industrial struggle, some of the union struggle. And then there are people who really want to just erase what's happened there over the past 100 years and kind of start fresh, because it's, having ruins everywhere and, having problems with segregation and all these other things is something they don't want to see. And that's often led by kind of older generations, I would argue, who were there when these cities were much more prosperous and they saw how things were operating. And now they see a much less vibrant city, and they kind of want to just start over. And here's someone very much from the Rust Belt chic camp. In fact, he actually uses the phrase, but a guy who wrote a book called The Cleveland Anthology, or he edited a collection, but he talks about, there's just something about Youngstown that stirs passion in me. I'm not gawking at ruin porn or glossing over everything that is wrong. I love Rust Belt cities. I love Rust Belt culture. I'm proud to be from the Rust Belt. That's what Rust Belt chic now means to me. It's personal. It's who I am. Very much representative of kind of this generation of people who are wanting to look at history and embrace it rather than erase it.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
It looked like a Finnish name. I mean, the family name.
Good question. I actually had the same thought. And it's interesting. I don't actually know his ethnicity, but there were, I have a small piece of Finnish as well. My mom did her genetic testing recently. But there were a lot of Finns who settled in the Cleveland area, particularly in Ashtabula, which was a port town, and it was prominent kind of in the late 19th. Ashtabula. I actually have a documentary film. It's called something Finntown, and it talks about the settlement of Finns in that region. Very concentrated. They had their own churches. They had, all the institutions. They certainly had saunas, and they brought these things. And the documentary interviewed their family members about what it was like to kind of grow up in that region. So there were a lot of Finns who settled in. You traditionally think about the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where Finlandia University is, for example, or Minnesota, but certainly the Great Lakes region in Ohio is also a settlement area for Finns. So maybe he may be Finnish, but I'm not sure. So this to me is what the region is. I have a couple of slides here. As I mentioned, it's certainly the ruin photos I showed earlier, but it's also these things. It's Chicago. I had to put LeBron James in because I'm from Ohio, and you have to show LeBron James. It's farm country. It's those Midwest scenes that you saw earlier. It's this beautiful mill, which is in Youngstown. It's the Great Lakes, which is 20% of the world's fresh water supply. It's this community in Dearborn, Michigan. It's an Ohio State game on a Saturday afternoon, and it's certainly Amish country, which, although I grew up very close to Youngstown, my dad, 30 minutes away now, lives in Amish country, and there are Amish buggies that go by every day.
Amish, not Muslim.
Yeah, it's both. It's all the above. Yeah, to me, it's this really large, diverse region that you can't just totally generalize. Certainly not generalize as being all white, unemployed factory workers. So it's all the above. And so when you really look at the region, as I mentioned earlier, it's this region. These are the states traditionally seen as part of the region. You know, the stats are a little deceiving, I think, because you can't get census stats on the Rust Belt. So what you end up doing is adding the population numbers for that entire region, which the Rust Belt is a constructed concept, of course, but you know, not all of Indiana is considered part of the Rust Belt, but you end up with these statistics. But in any case, you know, 60 million people in the region, 20% of the US population, you know, 4 of the 12 political swing states, which were really the reason that we have a President Trump instead of a President Clinton. You know, these states that traditionally went for Democrats over the last several decades, with the exception of Reagan or, you know, a few, some certainly went for George W. Bush, but they were considered sort of Democratic strongholds, Michigan, for example, or, you know, Wisconsin. But 4 of the 12 swing states are in the region. 4 of the 10 top exporting states are also in the region. So it's not a region that we talk about where all the industry is gone. There's still a huge level of industry in the region. Huge GDP in the region, you know, equal to the UK. If you look at the Rust Belt region, the 3rd largest U.S. city, and then I talked about the fresh water. I mean, 20% of the world's fresh water supply. It's also a region of great diversity. So if you look back historically, the Great Migration, where maybe 7 million people came up from the southern part of the United States into the Rust Belt region. This was happening at the same time as this wave of European immigration, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but some from Scandinavia as well, Nordic region. It was one of the world's most diverse regions in the 20th century. Many of those same people now we kind of all classify as white, you know, but back 100 years ago, we called them, you know, people from Italy or people from Greece or people from Ukraine. And they often settled in their own ethnic enclaves in these cities, in Cleveland, like a Slavic village or an Italian village. But that's not just history either. You know, even in the last, I think the Pew article was from 2015, yeah, just 10 states took in 50% of recent refugees, and many of those were in the Rust Belt, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. And then you can look at these kind of little funky stats like Dearborn, Michigan, which is, you know, it's called the Arab capital of North America, or the largest Somali population in Minnesota. There's also a large one in Columbus, Ohio. Largest percentage of Burmese is in Indiana, Fort Wayne, I believe. Largest Iraqi communities, Michigan, Illinois, and California. These are states that people don't look at as being very diverse places, but they really are. And then the world's largest Amish communities, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. Here's the Pew article from 2016, so fairly recent. There are also a lot of kind of legacy problems from the last century or more. Segregation is one of them. Cleveland, according to Huffington Post, is the most segregated city in the United States. There are a lot of complex factors, I think, that went into that. Part of it was industrial policy. You know, kind of the industrial titans of the early 20th century didn't want people to organize into unions, so they would often have worker housing for them, which the company provided, and then they would keep them kind of segregated. And the jobs were also segregated. So, you know, for example, unfortunately, African Americans held some of the lower paid positions. The people whose families had immigrated much earlier into the United States held the management positions. The Southern and Eastern Europeans kind of held a lot of the mid-level positions, and they were even more kind of segregated by skill. So like a lot of the Masons were Italians, for example. So they were segregated at work, and they were segregated where they were settled. Some of that, too, I think just is kind of a natural tendency to group, arguably.
Well, excuse me, what does that mean? Number one, Cleveland? Is Cleveland the most segregated?
It's the most segregated city in the United States, yeah, according to Huffington Post.
And how do you describe that? I mean, statistically, for instance, or I mean, is it whites, African Americans?
I think the article itself focuses on whites and African Americans now, and so you have much higher concentrations of African Americans in Rust Belt downtowns, for example, or than you have in, say, Washington D.C. or whatever, and The challenge comes up when you start talking about schools and job availability and the availability of food, for example. Some of these old cities like Cleveland or Detroit, they might not even have grocery stores downtown. I mean, it's especially after the riots in 1967, 1968. So it's really, really interesting questions that have a lot of complex historical reasons for them. Another reason, frankly, is white flight that started to happen in the 1950s and 1960s. People were fleeing kind of the downtowns. It really took off after the riots in 1967, 1968. Violent crime, quite bad. Poverty, disinvestment, all these challenges. Outmigration, I'm testament to this. I left in 1996. I can't wait to go back, frankly, at some point in my life, but there just weren't any jobs, so a lot of people left of my generation. I've seen studies that said, maybe 60% of people stayed, and 30 to 40% left, basically. This is a picture of Pittsburgh, which is one of the cities that's kind of held up as this model of rebirth, maybe a renaissance, as far as the Rust Belt city goes. The quote is from an author, I believe from Youngstown, but there's this pride, I think, for me of being from the region, because it's a region that really built the United States in many ways, and so this is one of the voices that's trying to capture the spirit of being from that region, and she has an entire essay about it. But any questions about the region in general, and then I'll talk about kind of Ohio and Youngstown.
Excuse me. I was just going to comment on the previous slide that you had on the area and how it made the East Coast as well. We have this classic American Studies book, Joel Garreau's 9 Nations of North America, where Midwest or Rust Belt is called the Foundry, and it's the place where American economy kind of developed. But if you would write that book again, what would you call that again? I mean, with the decline of economy in the area and whatnot. So that book is an interesting thing to read as a classic from 1970s and 80s, where the Foundry was still, the economy was still booming out there, at least before the decline. I'm losing my voice. Just interesting thinking about it as a political construction, as you said. And that book particularly looks at politics, environment, and economics, and created these 9 nations of North America. And that is one that was, at that time, really good. And on the other hand, it looks at North Dakota and Alberta and Canada as, he calls it empty quarter, as if there was nothing. Today we know there is oil industry booming in North Dakota and whatnot. So these political constructions keep on changing. It would be nice to have somebody write a book. Maybe you write a book.
I'd feel out of my depth, but I think that does speak to the point of how things evolve over time, right? And North Dakota, and you could even look just at where I grew up, Ohio, and then the South, for example. In the early 1900s, everyone left the South. I mean, there were 7 million people who left the South because, this is much too simplistic to say, but some of the reasons for African Americans, for example, is they wanted to get away from Jim Crow laws. For Scots-Irish settlers or others in West Virginia, it may have just been purely for economic opportunity, but there were a lot of kind of factors that led people to push and pull. Now it's arguably going the opposite way. You have a lot of people leaving the north to go south because the economic opportunities are greater. Again, very simplistic. I think the weather might play a little bit of a factor. Where I grew up is very similar to Finland, weather-wise, and some people want a little more sunshine, maybe. But there are just it's really interesting when you talk about that. And I think I'm not really an expert on the matter. I think I would say that the story's not over for this region. I think it's still very populated. It's still quite powerful economically. It's been affected deeply by automation and lots of trends that are affecting a lot of, every economy, arguably, globalization, a lot of processes. And so we'll see what happens kind of as things continue to play out. I think there are a lot of people who are trying to push it in, certain directions. And I'll talk a little bit about Youngstown. Ohio, Northeast Ohio in particular, Pennsylvania are regions that are also experiencing a hydraulic fracturing fracking boom as well. So that may have some impact. It already has, kind of where I grew up. So we'll see. I don't know if that. So I said I'd focus on Ohio, and I won't focus on it very long, but I kind of just wanted to focus a little bit so you could kind of get a sense of, what the state kind of is to me, and also for others. I'll have a funny little graphic up there in a minute, but this is an interesting story, which may seem kind of not at all related, but this is from an American football game in 2015, and Alabama was kind of, they're seen as kind of the peak of college football in the United States, and Ohio State played them, and they were these massive underdogs. And I was watching this on a Kindle, a very small screen, and it was fascinating because Alabama jumped out to this very large lead, and then Ohio State came back and won the game. And there was this turning point where the game really turned, and people just went absolutely crazy, and they panned on this one guy who has this Ohio Against the World shirt on. And I think it really symbolized what, frankly, I think it symbolizes what many Ohioans think, because it's this. I have a quote here, for example, this woman who wrote an essay, she moved to North Carolina as kind of the Sun Belt migration, and she talked about how, people would joke, oh, I'm sorry you're from Ohio, and this and that, or, and she joked back, hey, we actually have running water there, and kind of back and forth banter. But the thing that I find interesting with this is it clearly touched a nerve, because this image really went viral. I mean, millions of views on Twitter, Facebook. This company that makes these shirts and hats, I think they were barely selling any, and then they went, everything was sold out within. So it really kind of touched this nerve for many of the 11 million people who live in Ohio. The Goodyear blimp has everyone seen the blimp before, the Goodyear blimp? But Goodyear is a company that's generally always been associated with Akron, Ohio, which was once called the rubber capital of the world. They still have operations there. They now mainly just do testing. They don't manufacture rubber. But when I was a kid, we would drive through Akron. That's where my mom's from, and it smelled awful. You'd smell rubber production all the time, and so it's really changed a lot. But these are representations of Ohio that you can find online. We come from what's called the Rust Belt Wasteland, actually specifically from where The Godfather meets The Wire. The Wire is an American crime show, or the ruins of Youngstown. The reason I have this up, though, is because it shows you how diverse the state is, even in these, frankly, quite stupid representations of what the state is. There's the South, kind of centered around Cincinnati. There's West Virginia, and that part of the state, which is very rural, lots of hills. You have the Eat, Sleep, and Breathe Ohio State, which is where the capital of Columbus is. And then up north you have more manufacturing. Ghetto is where Cleveland is. Amish is where my dad lives. So it's this kind of funny representation that really boils down this complex state into these series of images. But that's why it's such a swing state, frankly, politically, because you have, for example, a Democratic enclave in Columbus. The Northeast, which was always a very strong Union area, has almost always been a strong Democratic region, maybe shifting a bit now, although Mahoning County, which is where Youngstown is, still went Democratic in the last election. And then much of the rest of the state, which is dominated by agriculture and more of a rural economy, and Cincinnati, which has always been kind of a more conservative region politically, tends to go Republican. But so you have, it goes blue, it goes red, depending on the election. And this is just kind of a funny thing. And one of the reasons I think Ohio is so fascinating is because this is trivia. It's maybe not a very Midwestern thing to kind of brag about where you come from, but these are all kind of Ohio facts. Ohio and Virginia have had the most presidents, 8. And Ohio's were kind of all concentrated in the last part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. Which state won the Civil War? Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman were Ohioans. We produced more soldiers than other states. first person on the moon was an Ohioan. The Wright brothers were Ohioans. Jesse Owens was an Ohioan. Rockefeller was an Ohioan. And then all these key cultural figures. Which is to say that really, especially at the end of the 19th century and most of the 20th century, it was this area that really produced these not just key industrial figures, but a lot of key cultural figures, and it's something of great pride. Oil economy, rubber, flight. Thomas Edison lived in Ohio for a while, so all these kind of key inventions of the 19th and 20th century that frankly still have a huge relevance in our world came from the region. And then I'll focus on Youngstown. These are some of the other kind of names. The Yo, murder town, crime town, home. This is a picture from Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which is somewhere where my grandfather worked. There's a clip, which if you're interested, I can circulate, but it's a song by Bruce Springsteen, if you're familiar with him, about Youngstown. So it's really a kind of a quick case study. So it was one of the world's largest steel producing regions. I've seen it was the world's largest steel producing region, and then it's alternately second. It depends on what you read. Frankly, it was part of the same kind of economy as Pittsburgh. It's in an area that runs Cleveland to Pittsburgh, and there were a lot of steel producing cities kind of in that area, Niles, Warren, Youngstown. For me, they were all kind of part of the same economy, but in any case, world's first or second largest steel producer. You can see where the population went from 166,000 in 1960. Actually, most estimates now, this is the last census data, but the population's still declining. They say it's probably around 58,000. And that's a huge population decrease. That's 2/3 basically. And if you look at Detroit or if you look at Flint, they've experienced similar kind of 2/3 population declines. Detroit on a larger scale, it was a city of nearly 2 million at one point. It's down to 500,000 or 600,000. What we call Black Monday in the region, we just had, you can't say celebrated the 40th anniversary of it, but it was the 40th anniversary of Black Monday back in September, which is when, out of the blue, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which was this homegrown steel company that also owned a large mill just on the south side of Chicago, so it was really a big player nationally, announced that it was closing. And for an economy that was totally dominated by steel, it was decimating. I mean, I think 10,000 jobs were lost almost immediately. They said for each of those steel jobs, it supported 3 to 5 kind of services jobs, and then within 5-10 years, the rest of the steel mills, U.S. Steel and all the others, had basically closed.
Most of that because of competition from abroad.
So I'll talk about that in a second, but complex reasons, not that simple, although that's, I think, what people kind of tend to focus on.
What about the unemployment rate today? I think it was 25, but that's 3 decades ago, 25%.
Yeah, so yeah, this was kind of right after the crisis. The unemployment rate today is, in the city itself, is above 10%, still. In the region, it's a little bit higher than the state of Ohio at large. I think it's around 6.5%. That was kind of maybe 6 months ago. I'm not sure what the latest statistics are, but similar. But the city itself is still struggles with unemployment. Yeah. So what happened? So this is the $1 million question, right? And people tend to focus on competition or offshoring of American jobs. You hear about it all the time. You heard about it recently, I think, probably. But for me, it's much more, it's a story of capitalism, right? It's a boom and bust. That economy really took off in the late 1800s, and it went into the 1900s, and then for a complex set of reasons, those jobs are gone. And for me, it comes down to geography. Youngstown was, if you look at it kind of, nobody saw it coming, but if you look at it historically, it was never as competitive as Cleveland, for example, which is right on Lake Erie. In Lake Erie, the interesting thing with the Great Lakes is that they're all basically connected. So you can actually bring a large freighter or vessel from Europe or Asia, and they can come down the St. Lawrence River all the way into the Great Lakes and all the way up to Lake Superior. It's all connected. You can go, a large boat can go. And so Cleveland was more economical, for example, as a steel producer because shipping prices were cheaper than they were in Youngstown, which was located on a river and then depended heavily on rail traffic. History, part of this is frankly a legacy of the Second World War, in my view. Most of the mills in Youngstown and frankly in Northeast Ohio, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, you can pretty much look at all of them. They were built in the early 1900s. And they never invested in huge upgrades. And so you had countries like Germany or South Korea or Japan who built these brand new steel mills, which were much more efficient after the Second World War. And then within a few decades, they were producing steel at a much lower price, much more efficiently, frankly, than late 1800s, early 1900s technology. Government policy, I read an interesting article maybe 6 months ago that talked about kind of the distrust of the Democratic Party in that region. And the government policy at the time was more or less to kind of let them go. There was a fairly large movement in Youngstown that was led by, it was a faith-based coalition that tried to purchase the mills and turn them into a cooperative. It would have required a big, big loan from the federal government. And at the end of the day, at the time, Jimmy Carter administration said no. And the cost benefit basically said, you know, all the money you'll invest on retraining and social services and stuff, it could maybe be more economical to provide this loan to the companies so that they can continue as a cooperative. It never happened, but I think it kind of is, more broadly, it's just a symbol of what economic government policy was at the time, which was basically non-interventionist. So it's kind of a let them go bankrupt model in the 2012 parlance, the Romney-Obama election. Automation was another factor. I mean, you know, what required tens of thousands of people to do in the early 1900s by, you know, the late 20th century, a lot of it was done with, it could be done with robotics or, you know, mechanical equipment or whatever. It just didn't require the same level of labor. And then, you know, offshoring certainly played a role. Much more complex than thinking about it outside the United States. If you look at the United States now, a lot of industrial production is in the South, for example. BMW has a factory in South Carolina. You know, a lot of auto manufacturers kind of have moved to the South. They may still have operations in the North, but they've opened a lot of new plants in the South. And, you know, part of that is undoubtedly because they have easier labor laws for companies, and it's cheaper to operate there. And so it's not just kind of offshoring outside the United States, but it's within the United States as well. So does that answer your question? Yeah. So what happens after this bust? So I was born in 1978. That's happened in 1977. So I don't remember the time of steel where I grew up at all. I mean, I just don't. But it was always kind of present where I grew up. And the reason it was present was because you heard, you know, I heard my grandfather, who was he worked at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. He was a member of the United Steelworkers. My dad was a United Auto Workers representative. They talked about it constantly. And then we also kind of grappled with all these effects of what happens after an economy goes bust like that. And they were arguably especially prominent in Youngstown, but you could look at a city like Flint and Detroit and see a lot of the same issues. But high unemployment, undoubtedly, the tax revenue basically evaporated. When you lose that percentage of the population and you're still trying to support the same level of services, I mean, there's just not enough tax revenue to cover it. So the schools really declined. The downtown, I remember going downtown in the early 1990s, and there were maybe 2 cars in the whole area. All the businesses were gone, basically. You went down to go to the courthouse, and that was the only reason you would ever go downtown. We in Youngstown really grappled with the mafia and corruption in particular. Official corruption, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The mafia thing is maybe kind of an interesting angle versus some of the other cities, but Youngstown was located, it's almost equally distant from Pittsburgh and Cleveland, so it was kind of fought over. Someone calls it the Belgium of mafia territories, because it was fought over by the Cleveland and Pittsburgh families that ran those areas. And after the steel mills went away, there was really an intense competition for any resources, and so the mafia really took off. And there were ties that eventually came out with FBI indictments of officials who were in the pocket of the mafia, basically, including our congressman, Jim Traficant, who eventually went to prison. He had served 4 or 5 terms in the Congress, and he actually beat a charge by the United States government at one point for mafia ties, even though they had a signed confession from him. But then 15 years later, they caught him on a separate charge. And then two factors which really continue in today, frankly. So a lot of these former industrial sites are brownfields still. I mean, they require extensive environmental remediation to make them usable for, frankly, almost anything anymore because of all the chemical dumping, all the production that happened at those sites over the course of a century, most of which was before the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency and environmental safeguards. And then the last one, you'll hear the term prison industrial complex, and casinos, frankly. Especially in the 1980s, local officials talked, how do we get jobs here? And there was this kind of a desperation to get people to work. And so they opened up several prisons because they were decent paying jobs. A couple of them, I think, have closed since then, but that was one of the things that they turned to. We have vacant buildings. We have, we'll bring anything in here for jobs, but prisons were kind of what they brought in. And then casinos, you'll see in a lot of these former industrial manufacturing cities, casinos have kind of picked up. Again, just looking at kind of revenue. But that's kind of not the whole story. And I think one of the general themes I would say about the entire region is that most of the things you'll read on it often, unfortunately, tend to focus on either the past and the ruin, or they focus exclusively on this, hey, there's this renaissance going on, and they're overly optimistic. It's this kind of boosterish look at the city. The story is much more muddy and mixed. And the reason I put these two guys, does anybody know who these people are? Probably not. But anyway, these are 2 world champion fighters that came from Youngstown. One on the left in the 2000s, Kelly Pavlik, and on the right, Boom Boom Mancini, who both famous people in the States, at least. So here's an article that came out recently on Youngstown, or within the last few years. But the reason I put the fighters there is because the thing with the city is that there's always been this group of people who's continued to fight to kind of keep the city in existence. I mean, you'll hear people talk, oh, you should just basically depopulate the region and just let it go, But first of all, that's maybe not the best policy. But second of all, there are these people there that are really fighting to make Youngstown a great city, even if it's not a city of 160,000 people dominated by steel again. And so, in the last 10 years, there's been a narrative of kind of rejuvenation. It's definitely not a perfect record, but it started with this Youngstown 2010 plan, which was done in the early 2000s, which basically was the first official document that recognized that, hey, this city's never going to be what it was at one point. It's going to be a smaller city. It's going to be a different city. And then you've had, especially through this alliance of, maybe university officials, city officials, congressional representation in Washington, you've seen these positive stories come about with the business incubator. President Obama mentioned it in a couple of speeches, especially this America Makes, which is for additive manufacturing. And then you've seen a lot of new investment in the downtown area in particular, which I think gives some people this really kind of renewed sense of optimism. Many of the things are kind of embracing the Rust Belt. There's a coffee that, puts coffee out that says brewed in the Rust Belt. There was a Rust Belt brewery in the city, and there's kind of this new wave of businesses that are really embracing the past. At the same time, depopulation continues. There are many neighborhoods which, are largely vacant. The city now has a policy like you've maybe heard with Detroit, where they won't service parts of a certain city because there's only one person that lives in it or something, and so they're basically letting parts of the city go back almost to wilderness, if you will. They won't service garbage or other things, plowing services, fire services. And so it's a very mixed story in the region. And my closing thoughts, I don't have good thoughts of my own, so I rely on a quote. I thought this was kind of a cool thing, but it's kind of a way of looking at the region, basically, and how a rusted piece of steel is more beautiful than kind of the original kind of new piece of steel, because it's much more interesting. Again, I just think it's kind of emblematic of a new approach of thinking in the area. But with that's the end of my jabbering on. Photo credits, good to thank those. Anyway, so questions, comments, anything at all?